शायद यार अपने
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Sorry, I think my...
Zunaira, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Zunaira Inam Khan, and I'm really happy that we have our guest here with us, our speaker, Mr. Obaidullah Baheer, who is a lecturer at the American University of Afghanistan. Thank you so much for taking the time out. Today we'll be talking a bit about, we'll be doing a recap, a year in review. We'll be having a very candid conversation with Mr. Baheer. If anyone has follow-up questions that they would want to ask him, please send them in the chat box below, and then we will be addressing them towards the end. Before we begin, I would like to hand the floor over to Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, President, Institute of Regional Studies, to give his introductory remarks.
Assalamu alaikum and a good morning to everyone. Obaidullah, I hope you are doing well. I just learned that you are in Kabul. So you will be able to give us the latest updates from there. 2022 has been an interesting year, but I think the Taliban have not been able to get the international recognition which they were hoping for. The political situation in Afghanistan is, I gather, a bit stable, but could also become unstable. The economic situation is becoming worse as far as human rights record is concerned. The West has many apprehensions, and then also the various proscribed groups which are present in on Afghan soil. There are still apprehensions in the neighborhood as well as in Europe and the United States of their becoming active. So I also feel that there is some sort of a struggle which is going on among the Taliban themselves, because there are people who still believe in the old mindset, and now you have people among the Taliban who want to move slightly away from the traditional, but then the definition of inclusivity and women rights and all the other rights are different in the Afghan context when you compare it to the context which is available in the rest of the world. So I think the situation in Afghanistan is still very challenging. And we would like to hear from you. What do you think about what has taken place in Afghanistan in 2022? And how do you see the coming year for Afghanistan? I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you. And I know you are extremely frank and candid, so we will ask you all these candid questions also. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Riaz. So moving on to our speaker. So I just wanted to say from our side as well, condolences on the attack, the recent attacks that have happened in Kabul. It's such a terrible situation, and we really hope that there can be some semblance of peace and security that can be established again. So now coming to our conversation, seeing all of these reports that are coming up about these attacks and these blasts that have been happening, recently we've been hearing that the law and order and the security situation had greatly improved since the Taliban had come to power, but now you're seeing a rise in these attacks again, and I think that there was an attack very near to in a mosque next to Mr. Gulbuddin Hikmatyar's office as well. So how do you see this rising tide of violence, and do you think that the ISKP element can be controlled under the current leadership?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. Always a pleasure speaking at IRS, being hosted by His Excellency and Zunaira. Do you want us to go question by question, or do you want me to give a breakdown initially? Because I would have liked to set up a context for our discussion. I think that helps, and then we can maybe lead into specific questions.
Yes,
what do you think?
You can obviously give an intro first, and then we can move on to the questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important to contextualize the past 1 year and break it down into different sections and sectors and what those concerns are. I think to talk about solutions to problems, we need to identify problems first. You're right about internal security. So two things that we have to remember is the law and order in essence of policing crimes, and then security in general with regards to terrorism and insurgencies. So the law and order situation in Afghanistan never was great. However, the reality is that you do not hear, because of the crackdown on media and coverage, is that crime rates in Afghanistan are currently off the roof. But none of it is registered, none of it is reported, most of it is dealt with extrajudicially. But things aren't great within the cities. You aren't safe when you're walking down the roads in the middle of the night, not out of the fear of being assassinated like you would have been in the past years, but you would actually be robbed and shot. We're having a Karachi 2.0 happening here, okay? So, and then on the other end, you have the terrorism threat. And that's something that you have to remember, that up to 2003, the United States and its allies in Afghanistan, they thought that the Taliban threat was done with, that now all we needed to worry about was rebuilding. And that didn't happen. Insurgencies have this weird way of finding a crack through the cement and growing out of it. And right now in Afghanistan, we're constantly seeing internal security turning bad. Now, look, the scale of the attacks or the consistency of the attacks might not be at the level where the Taliban had reached in the end of their 20 years, because we had a rumored number of 300 Afghans dying a day in the war at its peak, led by the Taliban. But right now, what we're seeing is very thought through operations, very sophisticated operations happening. You saw the attack on Mr. Hikmatyar, you saw the attack on the Pakistani embassy, before that on the Russian embassy, yesterday on a Chinese a hotel frequented by Chinese visitors. So you see that there is a very specific pattern to these attacks. It's targeting specific people. It is either completely banal and targeting students and teenagers in schools, or it's going to another extreme of targeting important individuals through both just proving the inefficiency of the Taliban. It's a tricky world. Insurgency is always complicated because there's a famous rule for counterinsurgency. It says, every day the government does not win, it is losing. Every day the insurgent does not lose, he is winning. And that's the reality of what is happening security-wise in Afghanistan. But there's also the sectors of our regional relations, our international relations. Again, you have to remember that a lot of the internal policies of Afghanistan are reflecting direly on our international relations and prospects of engagement, because a lot of states are answerable to their constituencies. And when they see the Taliban becoming this very unique case of human rights abuses in the world, they're really hesitant on engaging with the Taliban. So that's where our international engagement really stops, because when international players sit with the Taliban, the first conversations start with human rights, and that sort of clouds then anything else that could have been discussed or should have been discussed. And then you already see our regional relations from the incidents yesterday and the incidents before that. We seem to not be getting along with any of our neighbors right now. So there's that, and most of it can boil down to lack of cohesion within the Taliban. The Taliban even now act as an insurgent group, with different groups having different policies and different visions. But yeah, at the core of it, there's also the part of human rights. Up till March this year, the international community was more than happy to engage with the Taliban. I sat with members of Congress in the United States, and I was told that they were happy with the Taliban. I sat with a lot of international representatives, and that was generally the mindset. But then the Taliban started doing a thing, and there's an adage for it. It says, they don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So they started shooting themselves in the foot. It started with the school ban. Then you had the ban on public parks for women, segregated parks for women, because women aren't dressing modestly enough. The hammams, the gyms. Then you had the public floggings that restarted, and just one after the other were things that were really, really hurting their prospects of engaging with the world. And now we have the very strong rumor that end of December is when they're going to announce the closure of universities for women as well. And honestly, that just feels like the final nail in the hammer. We've seen crazy crackdowns on the media. We have seen I mean, the whole concept of freedom of expression is alien in Afghanistan. There is a body within their intelligence that calls you to their office and blindfolds you and shackles you and treats you like they would treat ISKP terrorists. If one of your tweet goes down, not so well with them. So yeah, it's been very difficult. It's been especially difficult for women, and a lot of their internal decisions and internal policies have been reflecting on them internationally. I mean, yeah, we could probably talk later about, are they the Taliban of the old or the Taliban of the new, and what's so different, what's so problematic about them, but that's just generally the context. So yeah, open to any further questions.
Thank you so much for that overview. It seems though, in talking to you today, that you seem to be slightly less optimistic than last time that you were at IRS regarding the Taliban behavior or how they've changed their policies. Because I remember the last time that you came, you were like, no, obviously there is still that element within them which are actually amenable and actually want to maybe open up the schools as well. And now we're talking about closure of universities as well. So how do you see that? Like what possibly could entice them now to move towards a more representative government, or move towards human rights, actually following human rights, or opening or allowing women's education? Like, what could the international community offer them that would bring them to that table, or is that not even possible anymore?
Look, I was going to move to this discussion of, I think that, yeah, maybe the 1.0, 2.0 isn't very helpful, but it is helpful to understand that this isn't the Afghanistan of old. This isn't the Taliban of old. This isn't the Afghanistan of old because the last time Taliban came to power, they were coming to power after a very long civil war. So people were extremely tired. They're willing to accept whatever alternative was there for the fighting. And they really didn't have a wonderful life to begin with, to expect much from the Taliban. However, this time the Taliban are coming to power after 20 years of a fairly decently built regime, or better than the civil war, at least, that had existed. So the people, a generation grew up in the cities. They expected better, they want better, and they've been demanding better. But also on the other end, the Taliban got a lot of exposure. You have to realize that the first Taliban that came to power, they came to power from Kandahar. There are people who'd never left the country, who some of them even till death probably didn't leave the country. But on the other end, this Taliban have seen the world, they've traveled, their families have grown up abroad, so on and so forth. So hopefully that's a change. But that being said, like the fact that this rumor of a possible closure and for universities actually originated from within the moderates in the Taliban, the fact that they leaked this possible move shows you that they themselves feel very hopeless and helpless in opposition to these things. I think someone had once told me that there are no good and bad Taliban, there are just good liars and bad liars amongst them. And I'm honestly beginning to think that there might actually be two different camps that are conservative and relatively less conservative. But they're both very passive. And you have to understand that one of the reasons genuine discussion isn't taking place even amongst the Taliban about things like girls' education is because both sides aren't very vocal about their support or opposition. Probably the support people are a bit more vocal, but when it comes to really pushing for it, they A, don't take the stance, B, the hand doesn't talk to the mouth. So a lot of the less conservative people aren't working cohesively together either so that they can represent a front. And you have to understand that, like in Doha, at least the thing was they were under one roof, they were talking to each other and they were representing one front. Now, even the less conservative ones, or those who were in Doha, they're very broken down and they're not really talking to each other, and there's constant paranoia of being watched by the Emir and not to displease the Emir, and that sort of creates a hurdle amongst them. So, I mean, look, part of my work is to not lose hope. But I mean, every day we have more and more interactions with them and with the international community. We just, I mean, I've said this to friends. I'm like, our fight isn't against oppression. Our fight is against hopelessness. Because their policies act like the Harry Potter's Dementors who are sucking out hope from you. So it's quite tricky. And I think we really, really have to find a way to keep that hope alive and keep seeing some level of progress. Because, I mean, bird's eye view, we're heading downhill, and we're heading downhill in lightning speed. And that's alarming. And very soon conversations will change. And when those conversations change, we will start seeing worse and worse options available on the table. So, I mean, I hope we don't waste this opportunity, but I mean, it's ultimately up to the Taliban, and all we can do is push them to act better, but they will have to make a decision and they will have to solve their internal problems. we can do it for them.
So, but you know what, it confuses me a bit, because I feel like one of the most important things to the Taliban when they came into power was getting the government recognized. And that was something that they were pushing for initially. And that's why the promises were made. So is recognition something that they don't really value anymore? Or is it that they've accepted that we're not getting the recognition, so might as well do whatever we want to do? And secondly, is the situation on the ground actually as bad as the media portrays it? Is it actually, when we hear about the floggings and the executions, and I think it was one public execution, but is it actually as bad on ground as it appears over the media?
Okay. So I guess the division in the Taliban is sort of on the international recognition thing as well, right? So those who are very traditional, very conservative, they act like that international recognition is irrelevant to them. And what has happened throughout the 1.5 years is that the other camp has constantly gone to the Emir and convinced him that they need to engage with the world and that they need to find a way to find a working relationship. And the interesting thing to me is, once I was sitting and discussing this with a high-ranking Taliban official, and his complaint was that the international community is never going to be satisfied. It's a slippery slope. They keep demanding things and then we get nothing in return. And when I walked out of that meeting, it later hit me that he wasn't saying this to me. This is what was being said to him, right? Which means that there's this expectation from the conservative people that have a time frame in their mind, that have certain outcomes in their mind, and they're demanding this without keeping in mind how the policies that they're enacting is really hurting that process. Example, Taliban ban girls from going to school in March after they've walked into classes within hours, they're sent back. A few days later, they ban opium in Afghanistan. Yet the Taliban are sitting and wondering, why didn't the world shower us with praise? And I have literally told them in meetings that the problem is, this is not how the world works. Everyone's answerable to their constituencies. They're going to remember the school closure more than they're going to care for your ban on opium. So you cannot do a good thing and then follow it up with a really bad thing, or the other way around, and then expect the world to cheer you up, because it cancels out. And suffering and pain is felt more than any good actions are. So sometimes they lack this very basic understanding of politics. And I guess this was one of the problems in the Taliban 1.0, or the first version of the Taliban that came to power as well. We expected them to be very sophisticated. We thought that they understood what they were doing. Yet slowly we started seeing that they really didn't. And even this time around, though their psyops during the fighting years was very sophisticated, though the way that they presented their front in Doha was very sophisticated, the reality was that was just a section of the Taliban. And once the whole insurgency started coming together and started trying to act like a government, we see all the cracks, and we see all the difficult players and the spoilers even within the movement that basically make it impossible for them to move forward. So they're faced with a lot of problems internally, and they have to figure a way out. And here's where the different camps come in, right? I don't know if you saw my recent Lawfare blog article in which I tried to map Adam Michnik's work onto Afghanistan. So Adam Michnik was this Polish philosopher, and he was part of the resistance, or in a way the opposition to the communist regime that was in place in Poland. And he divides the camps into 3 camps. So there were the reformists who accepted the communist regime and just wanted a reform within the leadership and within the policies, and they hoped that a new leadership could emerge. And their view was they wanted something like Gorbachev happening to them, or they wanted someone like Dubček, who had come up in Czechoslovakia and started the Prague Spring of reforms. So, I mean, there's that view. We could think about the Taliban and be like, okay, now that the Taliban are here, we can't get rid of them. Maybe we should start pushing for an alternative leadership. And I think the recent meetings, Qatar and UAE meetings with Mullah Yaqub, with like Anas Haqqani and the Haqqanis at their back, is sort of indicative of how maybe Mullah Yaqub is trying to become the face of the movement, and through it, we can hopefully find a way for new leadership to emerge. But you also have to understand that the Taliban have no mechanism for the changing of an emir. So when you give a bay'ah to an emir, it is not a term, it is not a sunset clause, it does not end in a few years. Emir is emir for life, you know? That being said, I think the Taliban have an advantage. They don't have a central ideology. They don't have central literature to refer to. So any new leadership that does emerge can basically change things drastically without being limited by that ideology and literature. But again, like I said, the reformist approach can only work once the Taliban start working together and start strong arming the emir, which is currently not happening. And maybe it's something that international partners or neighbors or the community needs to think about. The second is neo-positivists, and those are people like me who accept the Taliban as a reality, but don't work within the system, don't endorse the system. We work around the system. We are trying to create room for an opposition. We are trying to create a room for civil societies and civil spheres to exist. And that happens through whatever we're doing. One of the problems there is that you're very often seen as a collaborator with the regime, because you're making deals with them constantly to find and negotiate spaces for yourself. So you have to constantly self-examine and realize that, okay, I'm not becoming a Taliban, and I have to maintain my differences with them. The problem with both reformist and neo-positivist is both of them expect change to happen top to bottom, right? They expect the leadership to change somehow, and then the change to reflect on the people. That works sometimes, but mostly it is a problematic stance, because once the guns start shooting, you can't really take any of those two stances. You really, really have to be either for the regime or against the regime. And it's constantly becoming more and more difficult to be in the middle with everything that the Taliban are doing. And the last approach is new evolutionism. So unless we start having a conversation about changing grassroots changes within Afghanistan, unless the rural population starts getting educated, starts seeing reasons to live and not to go to insurgencies, and so on and so forth, Afghanistan is not going to change. We're constantly going to see more and more groups like the Taliban emerge. We're going to see more and more war, and nothing sustainable will come out. So, I mean, those are the paths ahead of us. None of them look very promising, and none of them are really working out in the short term. But I mean, they're there and they're happening, and we're just trying to use our energies and our hope to make something out of it.
Thank you. So I'm just going to tie in some of the audience questions into the conversation right now. So the first question is from Imran Sardar, who is a research analyst at IRS, and he wanted to know that as of now, we have seen the Taliban does not have the capacity to deal with the ISK threat, and this threat is looming with every passing day. So in the near future, how do you see future of counterterrorism in the region? Do you see any cooperation between the US and Taliban over counterterrorism, which is of course of US primary concern?
Okay, I think this whole ISK and CT conversation is quite interesting, because if you notice that the meeting that happened between Mullah Yaqub and Tom West in the UAE was like on two different frequencies. Yaqub tells you that he discussed security, and Tom West tells you that he discussed human rights, right? So they're like just, and this is like every foreigner meeting the Taliban, the statements that come out are like completely different conversations that they could have had with themselves in the shower, you know? So turns out that this card is being used. This card has been used for engagement with the Taliban, saying that, well, if you don't deal with the Taliban, the ISK threat is looming. It's going to be an international threat. The same threat is used by the oppositions to the Taliban, saying, well, the Taliban are never going to be able to deal with insurgent groups, international terrorist groups, and it's just going to always explode in your face. So this terrorism card is being used both ways. As to what can happen, you have to realize that a lot of times the policies that the Taliban are taking are specifically driven towards their own constituencies. They're constantly appealing to their lowest common denominator, which is the most conservative and hardline Taliban member. And the fear seems to be, and I think unrealistically, that the fighters who lose hope with the emirate are going to turn to groups like ISK. I do not think that there are enough commonalities between Taliban fighters and ISK fighters for them to switch stances. Primary amongst them is this whole religious divide between them, the sectarian device between them. And so you have to understand that is a fear, that is unfounded fear, but the Taliban will be very mindful, or especially the Emir will be very mindful of any cooperation with the United States security-wise, because if you look at ISK literature, one of their major accusations of the Taliban is that they're collaborating with the enemy of Islam and that they have a certain understanding, including the peace deal and everything else that followed. So the Taliban will be very mindful of such cooperation. Even if it is done, it will have to be very subtle. So there's that idea. And then the capacity to deal with ISK. Now, the problem here is that you would expect the Taliban, I mean, initially you look at insurgencies and you think, well, it's an insurgency. Now, if you're a terrorist group and you become a counter-terrorist entity, it should be just reverse engineering, yes? Just start doing everything that you're doing in reverse to stop other people from doing what you were doing for 20 years. But it's not that simple. Counterinsurgency is much more complicated than just not doing or countering and stopping the things that you would have been doing, which includes the Taliban are currently facing, and I don't want to get too much into the security aspect because it does become a very focused discussion then, but like this whole movement of explosive materials into the cities as to why is that happening, how is that still happening, the movement of arms and how that's still happening into their major cities, the networks that still exist and how to track them. The Taliban currently have very limited tools of intelligence available to them, and just generally they're being hit from all directions, and it is understandable that it'll take them time to develop this. But one of the problems is that the Taliban are trying to go with a scorched earth policy of counterinsurgency, and that is something that the United States used for a very long time, and they used it so long that when they started with their hearts and minds strategy, it didn't work because they'd already like burnt that bridge. And the Taliban are, in their very heavy-handed approach towards counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, are basically losing a lot of other pathways that they could have taken, and they end up creating more enemies than they end up winning friends. And we've seen that happening in Nangarhar. We've seen that happening with the NRF in Panjshir. And there really needs to be a discussion about changing that policy because they're losing allies faster than the Republic lost the war to the Taliban. So we have to be mindful of that.
Thank you. So the next question is that, so Farhan Khan wants to ask that why don't the Taliban announce their official cabinet? Why is there still an acting government?
Well, I was at a conference last month in Islamabad, and we were meeting Pakistani officials. And when I started speaking, I told them that when Argentina lost to Saudi Arabia, the Saudis really started chanting a slogan saying, "When Messi?" saying, "Where is Messi?" So I asked our Pakistani counterparts, when Taliban? So where are the Taliban? So at the end of the day, some of these questions really need to be asked of the Taliban directly. So there are two arguments here. Some people say, well, really, this is not just an acting government, this is really the government, and you don't need an official announcement, but this is a government, it's been here for more than 6 months, so it's by default. the actual government of Afghanistan. The second argument is that, yeah, there is a possible change, that this is an interim government. And the possible change initially started off with an inclusive setup. So they were expecting a lot of the Afghans who had left Afghanistan and the politicians in exile, I call them the rejects of Afghanistan, to come back in and be given a role in the government. But now the conversation has moved towards something more participatory in nature. So they're asking them that just to include some ethnicities, include some political groups, even if they're Islamist in slant, but they are in Afghanistan, just show us that you're not going to monopolize or keep power just within your own ranks. So I mean, the sooner that happens, the better. But right now, they confuse the chicken and egg thing as well, where they're already working on a constitution, something that has to be signed and approved by a permanent government rather than an interim government. So they have things running backwards. And it's going to hurt. And I don't think the international community is going to care for a more permanent or a partially inclusive government, even if it does take place after schools and universities have been completely banned. So they're going to do the same thing. They're going to ban that, then they're going to announce a more inclusive government, then they're going to wonder why the world isn't showering them with roses. And so it's a pattern.
Sorry, the follow-up question from Imran, which I didn't completely read, was also that would it be enough, would it be viable to empower the Taliban to go ahead with dealing with the ISK threat, or would it be enough, or Pakistan can play a role in dealing with counterterrorism within Afghanistan and the bordering areas?
I mean, I've said this in sessions to Pakistani officials that you end up paying a very high price of your association with the Taliban, yet it is not proportionate to the influence you have on the group right now. And that's for two reasons. One is that the specific subgroup within the Taliban that Pakistan has access to is not as influential in the larger scheme of decision making. Number two, that the Taliban are consciously trying to shed away the stamp of being associated with Pakistan, which probably can be a reason, and that's a segue to the next question as well, of border hostilities as well. And they try to appeal to their own ranks and to the larger Afghan population that, oh, look, we're not going easy on Pakistan either. So they go the extra mile to prove that stamp wrong. But again, I've always said engagement, as long as Pakistan is not talking to the Taliban and to the right people amongst the Taliban, you will keep having issues like ISK, which is a common threat. There is a growing concern that ISK's threat might actually be using Pakistan's soil to get into Afghanistan. And I think security cooperation and clearing out those concerns are going to be helpful to both sides. So, yeah, I mean, if we have such large common agendas and we're not talking about them, and I do realize that most of it is a hesitancy from the Taliban side to sit across the table with Pakistan, but there has to be, I think one of the problems right now is Pakistan is still using its conventional channels and conventional methods, hoping that they could reach the Taliban through them, but the networks have to be updated, the channels have to be updated, and you have to find a way to the right decision makers to sit down and have that conversation. So yeah, I mean, we should deal with ISK collectively, and it's a spillover. It'll always be a spillover. Remember that ISK is a group that believes in the near enemy before the far enemy, so they care for killing the close locality before they move towards other people. Zunaira, I'll just transition into the border tension issue as well. I mean, things aren't improving. Things haven't improved over the past 1.5 years. You have to also understand that the diplomatic mission available to you in Pakistan is not really one of authority, and it's not So look, Amir believes that girls should not go to school, yet there are 3 provinces where schools are open. Okay, so just to show you how posts are really dependent on the strength and power of individuals who are ruling those posts. So we call it, so Afghanistan does not have a democracy right now. What we call our system is the Andiwalism system. Andiwali means friendship, right? So whose clan are you from? Whose buddy are you? So let's just call it buddyism, right? So Afghanistan currently functions under the political model of buddyism. So when you go to an office and you present a written directive or decree, they tell you, I don't care for your document, tell me whose buddy you are, right? When you're crossing the border into Pakistan, the Taliban ask you, whose buddy are you? And you have to tell them, I'm that Qari's buddy, and then you're clear to go, right? So, and that sort of shows you the incohesiveness within them. And that incohesiveness really makes conversations very difficult as well. Like both sides are confused. I've sat with the European Union representatives and I've told them that, and they said that, oh, the Taliban confuse us, right? Because I mean, there are so many decision makers, everyone's saying a different thing. Who do we believe? And I was like, well, technically, you're confusing the Taliban too, because they really don't know who to talk to you because everyone's thinking down a different line. So 2 things that are very important. Both sides really need to have a unity of vision, meaning that the Pakistani authorities need to sit down and really need to spell out 1, 2, 3, 4. These are my goals. This is what I need. This is what I want. And this is what I will communicate, right? And then finding the right people within the Taliban. It might not be individuals, it might be a group of people, but finding them, sitting across the table and communicating these concerns to them. Because right now, the breakdown that happens isn't, we're still unable to track as to whether this has been sanctioned by central authorities or this is just individuals taking action themselves. It's just that crazy. But once the guns start firing, everyone's just going along with it, you know? So it's just a simple breakdown in diplomacy, and it's unconventional times. Unconventional tools are going to be needed, and we need to start developing them and start developing them fast. I personally feel that there is a sense within Pakistan and within others, and this sense is then advocated for by the same peace-loving Pashtun groups within Pakistan, who keep saying that the Taliban are an absolute evil, but then stop short of implying that we need to find a way to get rid of them. So the mindset of approaching the Taliban right now very often ends up becoming, they're going to go away soon, so maybe we don't need to do something radical. And I think that's a very bad mindset, because A, them going away isn't just going to be them disappearing. It's going to be another war. It's going to be another horrible flow of refugees. Iran has up to 7 to 8 million Afghan refugees right now. Pakistan is hosting a few million refugees right now. It's just going to keep getting worse. And then the security situation. So my argument is, it's not great right now, but it's very clear we're going towards worse. And if you start doing what you need to do, 2 years later, your workload will be 10 times more. Why not start today? Why not start addressing the problems and dealing with the Taliban as a reality and figuring out a way to find a workable relationship with them, rather than sitting and implying and hoping that they will someday go away, but know that if they go away, it's like a cloth of silk thrown on thorns and being pulled out. Okay, that's how the Taliban are going to go away, and it's going to hurt all of us. So we have to be mindful of that.
All right, thank you so much. I know you can see the chat, but I'm just reading out the questions so that in case someone's not looking at the chat, they know what we're talking about. So the next question is from Irta Fatma, who wanted to know that will the Taliban government allow to enhance women employment in policy-making mechanisms to secure women's rights in Afghanistan? Can something like this happen in the future?
Yeah, I don't think we have space for women in Afghanistan. I think we're just going to ask them all to leave. We're still figuring out a way for men to start delivering the babies. But on a serious note, it's just, It's just unfortunate. It's crazy, like the same Taliban want their women to be treated by female gynecologists, yet they're thinking about banning universities and schools. Literally female doctors have said this on record, on videotape to Taliban leaders saying, I will die, who will treat your woman after me, right? And it's been such simple fixes. There were so many women in Afghanistan, very high profile women that were very Islamic or very up to the Islamic standards that the Taliban have. And they could have just given them one ministry. Women are employed in Afghanistan right now. It's not that women have been removed from all ministries or all workforces. Women still work. There are still NGOs that employ women. There are still government sectors that employ women, and so on and so forth. But horrible PR, horrible preemptions of what would come next. And again, no cohesiveness of vision. So look, it's as simple as this. Whenever a revolution happens, one group comes to power, they have a different vision than the status quo that exists. Now, it's up to them. Do they enforce their vision on people using force and coercion? Or do they start having a conversation? The conversation looks like, here's my vision. What is your vision? Let's work towards a synthesis of both visions and find a third way out that is sustainable and that works for all of us. Now, the problem is the Taliban come in, they're in power. We have a vision. They barely have a vision because they're not talking to each other. They don't have a unity of vision, and they reject our vision. And right now we're up in the air, so no one knows what's happening. One day women are dressed modestly. Next day they don't deserve to go to parks. One day they're allowed to go to university while there is a barrier between the class. One day they're not, and so on and so forth. And that just confuses people and makes them lose more and more faith within the system. So it's very hard to predict the future when everyone's playing roulette, everyone's rolling dice, because there is no pattern, there is no system, there is no institution, there's no stable decision-making matrix. And that is all just extremely confusing and hurting us. So with regards to Arish's question, so Arish is asking what happened, that his friend told him that there was lesser crime in Afghanistan. This reminded me of a very funny meme, because the other day someone sent me a meme. We had an earthquake 2 nights ago in Kabul, and this guy posts saying, oh, it was a horrible earthquake. Someone else comments to him saying, no, but I just talked to one of my friends inside Kabul and he told me that the earthquake wasn't as bad. So you're lying, right? So one guy who was sitting inside Kabul feeling the earthquake, his experience was being negated and canceled out because someone had told the other person that the earthquake wasn't bad. And necessarily, here's what I'm saying, where we call these the lying machines. The lying machines come in. And look, I'm very clear on stating that since the Taliban have left very little room for media to exist, right? There is barely any freedom of expression. What's happening, it's always my word against Arash or Arash's friend's word, right? And we really need to start thinking about this. It's because people start generalizing their experience. Now, of course, when I'm sitting here, I'm not saying I have gone out and seen 10 crimes in Afghanistan, but I'm seeing people that are being hit and how they're being affected. And both points don't cancel each other. I'm not saying that the Taliban are not doing a great job at policing. I'm just saying, yes, the economy is horrible and the Taliban are so overstretched that they can't really cover everything. But I'm also saying that the Taliban's modus operandi is, if it is not reported, if no one reports that the leaf has fallen in the jungle, then the leaf has not fallen, and they're just trying to make sure, even with terrorism, you see yesterday's blast, the emergency hospital is telling you that they had 21 casualties and 3 already arrived dead. But the Taliban's official statement says, well, nothing happened. Just 3 foreigners got surface wounds, And that's crazy, how you think that if you don't report numbers, right? I've been to hospitals after attacks. I've seen the lists of dead people, and I've seen what the Taliban then are reporting, there's a constant intent on lying, and that doesn't help anyone. They think that it helps, but it just makes us lose more and more. So you cannot counter lies with other lies, and I guess from both sides. Okay, and here's a horrible thing about Afghanistan. 20 years ago, almost 20 odd years ago, Karzai started the amazing idea of the Facebook Chalawunke. And these were the people who ran Facebook, He got them buildings in Wazir Akbar Khan, and these were groups of people that sat down. Their whole job was to change the narrative on social media. So these were people with lots of accounts and thousands of accounts, and they were through different software tweeting or giving Facebook posts. So they were basically changing reality. And this by Walter Lippmann is called a pseudo environment. So it creates a pseudo environment in your head where you're constantly being told everything is all right, everything's all right. So even when you see a fact, you're processing it through this lens of confirmation bias. And then these stereotypes force you to even reject factual reality, So then what happened was Mohib and Ghani put this process on steroids, and they were dishing out $60,000 to networks and channels. And then they had huge employees of some of the most famous Twitter accounts in Afghanistan who were being paid by the regime to engage in propaganda. Now what has happened is the Taliban have restarted those projects. Their opposition, broken down into multiple sections, have all started this project. And now it's literally all sides churning out alternative truth, right? And basically what happens is, and this is what Hannah Arendt used to say, she used to say that organized lying does not intend to replace the truth with a lie. It just plans on undermining factuality itself, right? It takes you to a point where you just start not believing anything and facts become irrelevant. And that's something we have to be very mindful of in our region as well. In general, all our countries face such problems, and we have to be very careful of who manipulates the information and who is making us believe what. So, thing is, the economy is horrible. I don't know if I covered the economy initially in the context, but I thought that was something evident to everyone. We're faced with a crazy crisis, and things are only getting worse because the more the international community steps back, the lesser we start having real conversations about development projects. Right now, all our conversations are, we'll just give you enough aid to survive the winter. We'll just give you enough aid to survive this year. And that's not how economies get made. That's not how countries move forward. But again, no one's willing to have development conversations because the Taliban are making everything so hard, and donors barely want to donate to such a regime. And there's only much that you can do when you try to dodge the regime and work around it. So we've been stuck between a rock and a hard place. I was live yesterday and I said that good times seem to have lost their way to our door. So it's just been one hardship, one bad patch after another.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of the talk, so we just have a few more questions. One question was sent to me directly, which is that the Taliban's double standards on TTP is putting a lot of pressure on Pakistan to deal with it. Do you see any prospects of agreement between the Taliban and Pakistan over TTP?
Look, I think that sometimes we have to go with the argument of you reap what you sow. And I mean that in the sense of a lot of the Taliban, the regimes that were close to the Taliban, and I said this before August 15th, and I said that the Taliban were given a green light to go ahead and expand militarily and take up more and more territory, hoping that when the final conversation happens about an inclusive setup or an interim setup, the Taliban would have more leverage. Now, my stance then was, knowing the Taliban, I knew that once they started, everything was going to fall like a domino, and the Taliban were not going to stop at the gates of Kabul. They were going to go ahead and take all of it. And once the Taliban took all of it, they didn't owe anyone anything. No one had any leverage left on them. Like, if you remember, Pakistan was hosting a very large delegation of Afghan leaders, almost exclusively non-Pashtun leaders, to talk to them about their role in the coming interim government and how like they will hopefully be used as a counterweight against the Taliban. But I mean, we dropped the ball. The ball was dropped at that point, and now the Taliban are in power. The Taliban don't have that sort of financial dependency that they used to on Pakistan in the 90s. They have bad taste about Pakistan from after 2001. Musharraf has very clearly written in his book the money he received for the heads of the Taliban, which is why most of the people who are in power in Kandahar have a very bad opinion of Pakistan, and very little has been done to remedy those ties. And it has been simply, let's try and push them out as much as we can. People like Stanekzai, who supposedly studied in India, were pushed out of a possible ministry into a deputy ministry. So very little is done to bridge gaps, and more is done to, let's just try and push them into isolation as much as we can. So it just makes things even worse. So I mean, I think there's a genuine need to rethink the approach. TTP is an issue that can be solved much easily whilst having the Afghan Taliban on board. And that can only happen when there is trust. I mean, if you cannot resolve border disputes with them, how do you expect tangible intelligence sharing or support in the case of TTP? So, I mean, yeah, so there's some practical limitations. I mean, yeah, the Taliban really cannot stop TTP's flow or movement within Afghanistan. It's close to impossible, but they can politically facilitate quite a lot, and much can happen, but it can happen through cooperation, and cooperation happens through communication, which is not happening at a very large scale or useful scale for now.
Just in the end, I just wanted to ask that as an Afghan, because I mean, there are grievances on both sides of the border, and there's a lot of not just at the governmental level, like I'm talking about populations. There's a lot of hate that you see being thrown, you know, especially if you look at Twitter and other social media, you see a lot of hate being thrown. How do you think that that relationship can be improved? Is there a way to kind of get over that trust deficit that exists between the two countries? And is as Afghans, like, is there something that you expect Pakistan to be doing which we're not doing, in the sense that there's always this feeling of Pakistan's not doing enough, or it's doing too much by being involved in things it shouldn't be involved in? So what are your expectations as an Afghan, that how should Pakistan, as a friendly neighbor who wants the best for the region, how should we be, what should we be doing to help Afghanistan?
Look, Sunera, I'll tell you something that really does help in one's personal life as well. Okay, it's the concept of how do you empathize with someone, right? And the analogy here is, if you're in a ditch, okay, you've fallen in a ditch, I could either stand on top of the ditch, throw a light at you and be like, oh my God, it sucks to be in that ditch. I know, it's just horrible, you know? And I'm sympathizing with you, but I'm not really helping. It's not empathetic. The empathetic approach given by psychologists is you climb down, you sit with that person, you know, meaning you need to let that person fix things themselves whilst helping them, holding them, you know, like you just observe them and help them, enable them to solve their issues, you know. So I think that approach has always been missing. It's always been, I will all hands in, roll up my sleeve and get in and tell you how to fix things. And that also, Twitter isn't the real world. I know that must be a shock. Sometimes that shocks me as well. But I mean, note that there are organized machines that are changing what people think, okay, on both sides. And I'll be very frank about it. And the problem is that, and on my part, at least I've done my job. I went up to Amrullah Saleh at one point, and I said, everything that you're doing by painting Pakistan as the enemy is going to haunt Afghanistan later. If you're not going to be around, but our patients are still going to be standing at that border, and they're going to suffer the consequences of what propaganda you engaged in, you know? So at the end of the day, I don't think that there is a genuine animosity or grievances. I mean, trust me, Afghans get the worst end of the stick in Iran. When we go to Iran, I was a kid, I was 11 years old, and Iran in shalwar kameez, and they thought I was Pakistani, so they were very nice to me. And then they were like, where are you from? And I said, Afghanistan. And they literally, their face just goes sour, and they just turn around and walk away, you know? Like the Afghans literally are at a point where they hate Afghans as individuals. I don't think that's the reality. I think Pakistan as people has been one of the best hosts and neighbors of Afghanistan. And I say that despite, yes, I've had people who've called me a namak haram and whatever, but those aren't the reality, because the reality has been that the people have been very nice. Yet, what I want to say is you have to remember that out of the two of us, you are in a position of strength, right? And the position of strength, it has more of the burden of the better behavior, you know? So always remember that when you're faced with hate, remember that your country is doing better, that you have seen lesser and lesser of violence, and that person in your opposite you has constantly been told that Pakistan is central to whatever suffering that has taken place in Afghanistan in the past 40 years. So just contextualizing that, and this is not to accept bad behavior, but it helps to understand bad behavior. And I preach this to Afghan youth inside Afghanistan, and I hope that you preach that to your youth in your country. So people-to-people contact, trying to fix those small things that are taking us apart, are all going to be ways in which we keep coming closer. But I mean, as long as there's fighting, as long as there's just so much politics, we forget to humanize each other, and that just hurts all of us. So I mean, this is one region, we're in one neighborhood. It could be the best neighborhood in the world, or it could be the worst, and it's up to us to decide that.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you, Obaidullah. As always, it is always very insightful listening to you. I really hope that this region can move towards that connectivity and prosperity that we all hope that it should move towards. And our best wishes for everything that's happening in Afghanistan. I hope that it can reach a level of stability and prosperity. And, as we would definitely like to see that in our neighborhood. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll get you back on here again soon for more insights. Thank you for joining. And sorry, Sir, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz would like to say a few words.
I didn't want to say anything. I just wanted to, wish our honorable speaker, Baheer, all the best for the coming year, because I think that's very important, because this particular year is coming to an end. It was really a pleasure listening to you. And let's hope that the coming year brings a lot of peace, and it can also bring some economic prosperity and better relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and Khuda Hafiz.